Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is the story of every major Crusader military defeat. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world before the Crusades, how the road to defeat began. For many people, the Crusades are remembered as a series of epic battles between Christian knights from Western Europe and Muslim armies in the Middle East. Popular imagination often focuses on shining armor, legendary kings, heroic charges, and dramatic sieges. Yet the true history of the Crusades tells a far more complicated story. It is not only a tale of victories, but also one marked by repeated military disasters, political rivalries, broken alliances, logistical failures, and devastating defeats that reshaped the medieval world. To understand every major Crusader military defeat, it is important to begin long before the first Crusader army ever reached the Holy Land. These defeats were not isolated accidents. Many of them were the result of decisions made years, even decades, before the armies marched east. The roots of failure lay in Europe's political divisions, religious passions, military traditions, and the rapidly changing balance of power across the Eastern Mediterranean. By the end of the 11th century, Europe looked very different from the powerful continent it would later become. Most kingdoms were relatively small and often locked in conflict with one another. Kings struggled to control ambitious nobles. Powerful lords fought private wars over land and inheritance. Castles dominated the countryside, and mounted knights had become the backbone of Western warfare. These knights were trained from childhood to fight. Their lives revolved around honor, loyalty, and warfare. They practiced with sword, spear, shield, and lance until combat became second nature. Yet despite their courage and skill, they had little experience fighting in the unfamiliar landscapes of the Middle East. They knew forests, rivers, rolling hills, and European castles. They did not know deserts, scorching heat, or long supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers from home. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. The Christian Church possessed enormous authority over kings and commoners alike. The Pope was regarded not only as the spiritual leader of Western Christianity, but also as a figure capable of influencing politics across Europe. Pilgrimages to holy places had become increasingly popular, and Jerusalem stood above all other destinations as the holiest city in Christendom. For centuries, Christian pilgrims had traveled to Jerusalem under Muslim rule. Although conditions varied depending on the ruler, many pilgrims completed their journeys successfully. However, political instability and changing control over the region gradually increased tensions. Meanwhile, a new power was rising across the Islamic world. The Seljuk Turks had expanded rapidly during the 11th century. Skilled horse archers and experienced commanders, They transformed the political landscape of the Middle East. Their victories alarmed the Byzantine Empire, which had once dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire itself was one of the oldest surviving states in the world. Centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, it preserved Roman traditions while developing its own distinct culture. Its armies had defended Europe against countless invasions for centuries. But by the late 11th century, the empire faced one of the greatest crises in its history. In 1071, the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Mansurah. Although historians continue to debate every detail of the battle, its consequences were undeniable. Much of Anatolia, the empire's heartland and primary source of soldiers, gradually fell under Turkish control. This loss weakened Byzantium economically, militarily, and politically. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos inherited an empire struggling to survive. He desperately needed trained soldiers to recover lost territories. Instead of requesting a massive religious war, he initially sought professional mercenaries from Western Europe. His appeal would eventually reach Pope Urban II. What happened next changed world history forever. In 1095, Pope Urban II gathered church leaders and nobles at the Council of Clermont in France. His speech became one of the most influential addresses of the Middle Ages. Although different versions survive, the central message remains clear. Christians were called upon to aid their Eastern brethren and reclaim the Holy Land. The response exceeded all expectations. Thousands of knights pledged themselves to the expedition. Tens of thousands of ordinary people joined them. Farmers abandoned their fields. Craftsmen sold their possessions. Women, children, monks, priests, merchants, and adventurers all prepared for an extraordinary journey toward Jerusalem. Many believed they were participating in God's plan. Others hoped to earn wealth, land, or prestige. Some sought forgiveness for past sins. Still others simply followed charismatic local leaders without fully understanding the enormous dangers ahead. This enormous movement created a problem that few leaders had anticipated. No medieval government possessed the administrative capacity to organize such a vast migration. Roads became crowded with pilgrims and soldiers. Food quickly became scarce. Disease spread through overcrowded camps. Supplies frequently ran out. Long before the Crusaders encountered Muslim armies, they were already suffering from hunger, exhaustion, and poor organization. Discipline varied enormously from one group to another. Wealthier nobles could afford experienced knights, armored horses, wagons filled with supplies, and trained servants. Poorer pilgrims often carried little more than walking sticks and simple clothing. These differences would become increasingly important as the crusade progressed. The military structure itself presented another challenge. Unlike modern armies operating under unified command, Crusader forces consisted of independent contingents led by powerful nobles. Each commander possessed his own ambitions, advisors, finances, and political interests. Cooperation depended on negotiation rather than absolute authority.
Disagreements frequently delayed decisions. Personal rivalries undermined strategy. Pride often replaced careful planning. The Byzantine emperor expected the arriving Crusaders to respect imperial authority and return recovered territories to the empire. Many Crusader leaders accepted these conditions reluctantly. Others distrusted the Byzantines from the very beginning. This mutual suspicion would poison relations throughout the Crusades. Cultural differences added further complications. Western Europeans often regarded Byzantines as overly sophisticated, politically manipulative, and unreliable. Byzantines frequently viewed the Crusaders as uncivilized, violent, and difficult to control. Neither side fully understood the other's traditions or priorities. The misunderstandings repeatedly damaged military cooperation. Across the Islamic world, political unity was also far from complete. Different dynasties competed for influence. Regional rulers pursued their own ambitions. Cities defended local interests. Sunni and Shia political rivalries further complicated the situation. Ironically, the Crusaders initially benefited from these divisions. But Muslim leaders gradually learned valuable lessons from early encounters with Western armies. Over time, commanders such as Zengi, Nur-ad-Din, and later Saladin would build increasingly effective coalitions capable of confronting the Crusader states. Their success did not depend solely upon larger armies. They mastered intelligence gathering. They coordinated logistics. They exploited enemy weaknesses. They avoided unnecessary risks. Most importantly, they learned patience. Many Crusader commanders, by contrast, sought decisive battles that promised glory and rapid victory. This difference in strategic culture would eventually produce some of medieval history's most famous military disasters. The environment itself favored defenders familiar with the land. Summer heat exhausted heavily armored European knights. Water sources became critical objectives. Mountain passes restricted movement. Deserts punished logistical mistakes with merciless efficiency. Every kilometer marched eastward increased dependence on fragile supply lines. Food spoiled, animals died, weapons broke. Armor became unbearably heavy beneath the relentless sun. Disease spread wherever large armies gathered. Even successful campaigns left soldiers physically weakened. When battles finally occurred, many Crusaders were already exhausted before drawing their swords. Another overlooked factor involved communication. Messages traveled slowly. Orders were misunderstood. Scouts sometimes disappeared. Enemy movements remained uncertain until it was too late. Rumors frequently shaped military decisions more than reliable intelligence. In medieval warfare, incomplete information could prove just as deadly as enemy weapons. The Crusaders also underestimated the flexibility of their opponents. European knights excelled in close combat. A fully armored cavalry charge could shatter many formations. However, Turkish horse archers rarely offered such opportunities. Instead, they harassed enemy columns for days. They attacked supply wagons. They targeted isolated units. They retreated before heavy cavalry could engage. Then they returned again and again and again. This style of warfare frustrated Western commanders accustomed to decisive engagements. Fatigue accumulated, morale declined, discipline weakened. Eventually mistakes appeared. The enemy waited patiently. When the decisive moment finally arrived, it often came on terms chosen by the defenders rather than the invaders. These patterns would repeat throughout Crusader history. Sometimes the Crusaders won spectacular victories, despite overwhelming odds. Yet many of their greatest defeats followed remarkably similar patterns: overconfidence, poor coordination, political divisions, logistical collapse, misreading the enemy, ignoring experienced local advice, underestimating geography, failing to secure water, breaking formation, pursuing glory instead of strategy. Each disaster reinforced lessons that future commanders sometimes ignored. As this long story unfolds, we will examine every major Crusader military defeat, not simply as isolated battles, but as interconnected chapters in one of history's longest military struggles. Some defeats destroyed entire armies. Others led to the fall of kingdoms. Some altered the balance of power for generations. Others revealed weaknesses that enemies would later exploit with devastating effect. The first great catastrophe would arrive even before the main Crusader army reached the Holy Land. It involved thousands of enthusiastic but poorly prepared pilgrims who believed faith alone could overcome military reality. Their tragic expedition became the first warning that courage without discipline could end in disaster. It was called the People's Crusade, and it ended in one of the most complete military catastrophes of the entire crusading era. The People's Crusade, the first great Crusader. Military disaster. The First Crusade is often remembered for the armies of famous nobles who eventually captured Jerusalem. Yet before those disciplined feudal armies even began their campaign in earnest, another crusading force had already set out. It was larger in enthusiasm than in military ability, driven more by faith than by strategy, and led not by great kings, but by charismatic preachers. Its fate would become the first major military disaster of the crusading era. The movement began almost immediately after Pope Urban II called for the crusade in 1095. News spread across towns, villages, monasteries, and marketplaces with astonishing speed. Few people had ever heard a message as powerful as this. They were told that by taking up the cross and journeying to Jerusalem, they could perform a sacred act of devotion and receive spiritual rewards. For thousands of ordinary men and women, there was no reason to wait. Instead of remaining until the official departure date, planned by experienced nobles, many believed that God would guide them if they simply started walking. Among the most influential figures to inspire this movement was a wandering preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Contemporary chroniclers described him as humble in appearance, yet remarkably persuasive. Riding a donkey and wearing simple clothing, he traveled from village to village, delivering passionate sermons. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Many listeners believed they were hearing a man chosen directly by God. Whether every legendary story about him is true remains uncertain, but there is little doubt that his preaching inspired thousands to join the expedition. The people who answered his call represented every level of medieval society. Some were peasants who had never traveled beyond neighboring villages. Others were craftsmen hoping for a better future. There were merchants, monks, widows, children, elderly pilgrims, and impoverished knights. A small number possessed military experience, but the overwhelming majority had never fought in a major battle. Many carried farming tools rather than proper weapons. Some marched with little more than clubs or hunting knives. Others believed that divine protection would be stronger than armor. Few understood the enormous distance between France and Jerusalem. Fewer still appreciated the dangers waiting beyond Europe. As the growing columns of pilgrims moved eastward, problems appeared almost immediately. Food supplies proved inadequate. The organizers had no centralized system for purchasing grain or transporting provisions. Villages along the route quickly exhausted their resources. Hungry pilgrims often demanded food from local populations. Sometimes they paid. Sometimes they simply took what they needed. These incidents increased tensions wherever the crusading columns passed. Discipline steadily deteriorated. Without an established chain of command, different groups behaved according to their own leaders' decisions. Arguments became common. Some participants abandoned slower companions. Others separated from the main body in search of supplies. The once unified pilgrimage gradually fragmented into numerous smaller groups. Each became more vulnerable than the last. Even before reaching Byzantine territory, violence erupted in several regions. Jewish communities in parts of the Rhineland suffered horrific attacks from extremist crusading bands. Although church leaders and some local rulers attempted to protect them, many innocent people were murdered. These atrocities were not part of the original goal of the crusade, yet they revealed a dangerous reality. Large, poorly controlled crowds, driven by religious passion, could become unpredictable. Military discipline was already collapsing before the expedition encountered its intended enemy. Months after leaving home, the People's Crusade finally approached the Great Walls of Constantinople. Nothing had prepared these travelers for the sight before them. The city seemed unimaginably wealthy. Its massive stone walls stretched across the landscape. Golden church domes reflected sunlight. Bustling markets overflowed with goods from Asia, Africa, and Europe. For many Western pilgrims, Constantinople appeared larger than any city they had ever imagined. But while the pilgrims admired the city, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos viewed their arrival with growing concern. He had requested trained knights. Instead, tens of thousands of poorly organized civilians had appeared outside his capital. Many were hungry. Some had already looted nearby farms. Others ignored Byzantine authority completely. The emperor feared that these supposed allies might become a greater threat than the Turks themselves. Determined to prevent disorder, Alexios supplied the pilgrims with food whenever possible and urged them to wait for the arrival of the professional Crusader armies.
His advice was sound. Experienced nobles were still traveling across Europe with better equipped forces. United, they would possess far greater military strength. Separated, the People's Crusade faced overwhelming danger. But patience was in short supply. Many pilgrims believed every delay represented a lack of faith. Rumors spread through the camps. Some claimed Jerusalem lay only a few weeks away. Others insisted that Turkish resistance had been exaggerated. Confidence replaced caution. Ignoring repeated warnings from Byzantine officials, the leaders demanded passage across the Bosporus into Anatolia. Reluctantly, Emperor Alexios agreed. Perhaps he hoped that removing the restless pilgrims from the vicinity of Constantinople would restore order. Perhaps he believed they might at least survive until the professional armies arrived. Either way, thousands crossed into Asia Minor. They entered enemy territory. Almost immediately, serious problems returned. Food remained scarce. Water sources became increasingly important. Reconnaissance was poor. Few leaders possessed accurate maps. Even fewer understood the terrain. The Seljuk Turks observed everything. Rather than rushing into battle, they watched patiently. They measured the invaders' discipline. They studied their movements. They identified weaknesses. Soon those weaknesses became impossible to ignore. The crusading camp divided into rival factions. Different commanders argued over strategy. Some advocated caution. Others demanded immediate attacks against nearby Turkish settlements. Eventually, aggressive voices prevailed. A force marched toward the fortress of Zaragordos, hoping to secure supplies and establish a stronger position. Initially, the operation seemed successful. The fortress fell with relatively little resistance. Celebration spread through the camp. Many believed God had already begun granting victory, but appearances proved deceptive. The Seljuk commander had no intention of sacrificing soldiers in a costly assault. Instead, he surrounded the fortress. Every route leading to fresh water was cut off. The Crusaders soon discovered the terrible reality of siege warfare in the harsh Anatolian landscape. Inside the fortress, thirst became unbearable. Water reserves disappeared rapidly. Animals died first. Then people began searching desperately for any remaining moisture. Chroniclers describe scenes of unimaginable suffering. Some drank the blood of slaughtered animals. Others searched mud for dampness. Many weakened beyond the ability to fight. No relief force arrived. No miracle broke the siege. The defenders had trapped themselves. Eventually, the surviving Crusaders surrendered. Some accepted conversion to Islam to save their lives. Others refused and were killed or enslaved. The loss at Zaragorda should have served as a final warning. Instead, those still waiting at the main camp remained unaware of the full disaster. False reports spread that the expedition had won a magnificent victory. Excitement swept through the camp. Pilgrims demanded another advance. Despite the objections of more cautious voices, thousands marched toward an area near Sivito. This time the Seljuk commander prepared a far deadlier response.
The Turkish army carefully selected favorable ground. Scouts tracked every Crusader movement. Hidden positions were established. Horse archers waited patiently. The Crusaders advanced without proper reconnaissance. Many believed they were pursuing a retreating enemy. Instead, they were walking directly into a carefully prepared trap. The disaster that followed would become one of the most complete defeats in crusading history. The Battle of Cîteaux, the destruction of the People's Crusade. By the autumn of 1096, the People's Crusade stood on the edge of catastrophe, though few within its ranks realized it. The crushing loss at Zaragoza had already weakened the expedition, but confusion and false rumors prevented many from understanding how serious the situation had become. Instead of learning from defeat, thousands of pilgrims convinced themselves that victory was close at hand. The Seljuk Turks understood the reality far better. Their commander, Kilij Arslan I, had initially underestimated the Crusaders. When news first reached him that enormous numbers of Europeans were crossing into Asia Minor, he assumed they were merely another group of undisciplined raiders. At first, he focused on conflicts elsewhere rather than confronting them personally. But as reports became clearer, he quickly recognized both the danger and the opportunity. The People's Crusade was not a professional army. It lacked experienced commanders. Its soldiers rarely fought together. Its supply system barely existed. Its discipline was breaking down every day. Rather than launching a costly assault against fortified positions, Kilij Arslan chose patience. He allowed the Crusaders to move deeper into unfamiliar territory, while his scouts observed every step they took. Inside the Crusader camp, confidence continued to grow for all the wrong reasons. Rumors spread that nearby Turkish settlements were filled with riches. Some claimed abandoned villages contained enough food to feed everyone. Others insisted that the Seljuk army had fled in fear. No one knew which stories were true. Many did not care. Small groups began leaving camp without orders, hoping to seize supplies or treasure before anyone else. This lack of discipline created exactly the opportunity the Seljuks had been waiting for. On the morning of the battle near Cîteaux, bands of Crusaders advanced through wooded hills and narrow valleys, believing they were chasing a retreating enemy. Instead, they were walking into an ambush. The first warning came suddenly. Arrows began falling from the trees. Before many Crusaders even understood what was happening, mounted Turkish archers emerged from concealed positions. Their horses moved swiftly across the rough ground. They fired arrows while riding at full speed, striking from a distance before disappearing again. The Crusaders tried to organize a defense, but confusion spread almost instantly. Some charged towards the attackers. The horse archers simply rode away. Others attempted to form defensive lines. Fresh waves of arrows broke those formations apart. Unlike the heavily armored knights who would arrive later with the main crusade, most members of the People's Crusade possessed little protection. Many carried wooden shields that could not stop repeated volleys. Others had no armor at all. Every arrow found new victims. Panic spread faster than the enemy. Men shouted conflicting orders. Families searched desperately for one another. Pilgrims who had never experienced battle froze in terror. Others fled into nearby forests, hoping to escape. But the Turks had planned for this as well. Mounted warriors surrounded fleeing groups, cutting off every route of escape. Those who tried to hide were hunted through the woods. Those who resisted were overwhelmed. Those who surrendered often became prisoners. The battle rapidly became a massacre. Attempts to organize resistance collapsed almost immediately. Without experienced officers directing movements, every unit fought independently. Communication disappeared. Courage alone could not replace military discipline. As more Crusaders fled towards their camp, the panic only intensified. News traveled faster than facts. Some believed the entire Turkish army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Others claimed every leader had already been killed. Neither rumor was true. But in battle, fear often matters more than truth. The camp itself quickly dissolved into chaos. Wagons overturned, animals stampeded, supplies were abandoned. People struggled simply to survive. The Seljuk cavalry pressed their advantage relentlessly. Rather than allowing the Crusaders time to regroup, they attacked continuously, preventing any organized defense from forming. Every failed attempt at resistance weakened morale further. The People's Crusade was no longer an army. It had become a desperate crowd trying to escape destruction. Among the few leaders who attempted to restore order was Peter the Hermit. Ironically, he was not present on the battlefield itself. He had returned to Constantinople to seek additional support and supplies from Emperor Alexios, the first Komnenos. His absence left the expedition without its most recognizable figure during its greatest crisis. Leadership fell to men who lacked both authority and experience. Their efforts could not stop the collapse. By the end of the fighting, the People's Crusade had effectively ceased to exist. Thousands lay dead across the countryside. Thousands more were captured. Many survivors scattered in every direction, abandoning any hope of reaching Jerusalem. Only a relatively small number managed to escape toward the Byzantine-held coast, where imperial ships rescued them and carried them back across the Bosporus. For Emperor Alexios, the disaster confirmed every fear he had expressed. He had warned the pilgrims not to advance alone. He had urged them to wait for the professional Crusader armies. He had understood that faith could not replace military preparation. His advice had gone largely ignored. For Kili Arslan, the victory brought confidence. He believed the crusading threat had been eliminated. The Europeans, in his view, appeared poorly organized and easy to defeat. This assumption would soon prove to be one of his greatest mistakes. Because while the People's Crusade had been destroyed, the real Crusader armies were still marching east. Unlike the pilgrims who had just perished, these new forces were led by experienced nobles, accompanied by heavily armored knights, and supported by far better organization. The Seljuk Sultan had won a remarkable victory, but he had not yet faced the true military strength of the First Crusade. The Battle of Civito became the first great military defeat of the crusading movement, and it revealed lessons that would echo throughout the next 2 centuries. It showed that religious enthusiasm could not compensate for poor leadership. It proved that discipline mattered more than numbers. It demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Turkish horse archers against disorganized European forces. Most importantly, it established a pattern that would appear again and again in Crusader history: overconfidence, poor intelligence, ignoring experienced advice, breaking formation, underestimating the enemy. Each of these mistakes would return in later campaigns, sometimes with consequences even more devastating than Civito. The People's Crusade had ended in disaster before Jerusalem was ever within sight. But the First Crusade itself was only beginning. Soon, Europe's greatest nobles would arrive in the East, determined to succeed where the Pilgrims had failed. For a time they would achieve astonishing victories, yet hidden beneath those triumphs were the same weaknesses that had destroyed the People's Crusade. Those weaknesses would eventually lead to even greater defeats. The princes arrive, victory that hid the seeds of future defeat. The destruction of the People's Crusade marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the crusading movement. While the scattered survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened, a very different force was making its way toward Constantinople. These were not desperate pilgrims armed with farming tools. They were professional warriors. Across Europe, some of the most powerful nobles had answered Pope Urban II's call. Each brought experienced knights, trained infantry, engineers, priests, servants, and supplies. Unlike the People's Crusade, these armies had been organized months in advance. Even so, they were not one united army. Each contingent followed its own lord. Each noble had his own ambitions, advisors, and political goals. The greatest challenge facing the crusade was no longer simply defeating the enemy. It was keeping the Crusaders united. Among the most respected commanders was Godfrey of Bouillon. Known for his discipline and personal courage, he inspired loyalty among his followers. Another powerful leader was Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles to join the expedition. Then came Bohemond I of Taranto, an experienced warrior whose military talents were matched by his political ambition. His nephew, Tancred, quickly gained a reputation for boldness and aggressive leadership. Alongside them marched many other nobles, each commanding his own force. Together, they formed one of the largest military expeditions medieval Europe had ever produced. When they reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos greeted them with caution rather than celebration. The emperor had not forgotten the chaos caused by the People's Crusade, nor had he forgotten that many Western nobles viewed Byzantium with suspicion. To protect his empire, Alexios required each major Crusader leader to swear an oath. Any territory once belonging to Byzantium, but recovered during the campaign, would be returned to imperial control. Some nobles accepted reluctantly. Others argued. Several deeply distrusted Byzantine intentions. Although agreements were eventually reached, genuine trust never developed. This growing mistrust would later contribute to some of the Crusaders' greatest military and political disasters.
Their first major objective was the city of Nicaea. Once a Byzantine possession, it had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate in Anatolia. Unlike the undisciplined attacks of the People's Crusade, the princes approached the siege carefully. The city possessed formidable walls. Its defenders were experienced. A direct assault would likely fail. Instead, the Crusaders surrounded the city while Byzantine engineers coordinated operations. Meanwhile, Sultan Kilij Arslan I rushed back after realizing that the new Crusader army was far more dangerous than the pilgrims he had destroyed months earlier. Confident from his victory at Civito, he attempted to break the siege. This time, however, the outcome proved very different. The Crusader knights remained disciplined. Their commanders coordinated movements. Infantry supported cavalry. Supply lines functioned more effectively. Repeated Seljuk attacks failed to break the Crusader lines. Eventually, Kilij Arslan withdrew. For the first time, he recognized that these newcomers represented a serious military threat. Yet even in victory, tensions appeared. Rather than allowing the Crusaders to storm Nicaea, Emperor Alexios secretly negotiated the city's surrender. Byzantine troops entered first. Imperial banners replaced Seljuk standards. The Crusaders found themselves denied the opportunity to plunder the city. Many knights believed they had been cheated of rewards they had earned through months of hardship. Resentment spread through the army. Although the alliance remained intact, distrust toward Byzantium deepened. The Crusaders marched onward into the heart of Anatolia. Now they faced an enemy determined to avoid repeating earlier mistakes. Kilij Arslan abandoned attempts to defend every fortress. Instead, he adopted a strategy that would become increasingly familiar. He denied supplies. He poisoned wells. He destroyed crops. He forced the Crusaders to cross barren countryside where food and water became desperately scarce. The summer sun beat relentlessly upon the marching army. European armor, so effective in close combat, became almost unbearable beneath the intense heat. Horses weakened. Pack animals died. Water became more valuable than gold. Despite these hardships, discipline generally held. The princes enforced stricter organization than had existed during the People's Crusade. Scouts monitored enemy movements, columns marched in formation. Rear guards protected supply wagons. These precautions prevented another disaster. Still, Turkish horse archers constantly harassed the advancing army. They rarely sought decisive battle. Instead, they attacked isolated units. They fired arrows from a distance before disappearing over the horizon. They exhausted men and animals alike. Every day became a contest of endurance. The Crusaders gradually realized that victory in the East required far more than battlefield courage. Logistics determined survival. Water determined movement. Patience determined success. Eventually, the opposing armies met near Dorylaeum. At first, the Crusaders appeared dangerously vulnerable. One column had advanced ahead of the others, and suddenly found itself surrounded by large numbers of Seljuk horsemen.
arrows rained down from every direction. Turkish cavalry struck quickly before retreating. The Crusader camp came under fierce attack. For several hours, defeat seemed possible. The memory of Cîteaux haunted many survivors.
Had the Turks once again trapped a divided Crusader force, the situation grew increasingly desperate. But unlike the People's Crusade, these commanders maintained discipline under pressure. Messengers raced across the countryside requesting reinforcements. Rather than fleeing, the isolated Crusaders held their ground. Their knights dismounted when necessary. Infantry formed defensive positions. Time became their greatest ally. Finally, reinforcements arrived. Fresh Crusader contingents appeared on the battlefield. Together, they launched a coordinated counterattack. For the first time, the Seljuk horse archers found themselves unable to isolate individual groups. The combined weight of heavily armored European cavalry gradually forced Kili Arslan's army to withdraw. The Battle of Dorylium ended in Crusader victory. Yet beneath the triumph lay important lessons. The Crusaders had survived because they remained united. Had reinforcements arrived only slightly later, the outcome might have resembled the catastrophe at Cîteaux. The battle demonstrated that even disciplined Crusader armies remained vulnerable when separated. It also taught the Seljuks valuable lessons. Direct confrontation against concentrated Crusader forces could prove costly. Future Muslim commanders would increasingly rely on patience, mobility, attrition, and careful planning rather than seeking immediate decisive engagements. These lessons would eventually produce some of the greatest Crusader defeats in history. For now, however, morale soared. The princes believed that God continued to favor their cause. They had survived Anatolia. They had defeated the Seljuk Sultan. Jerusalem seemed one step closer, yet the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. Beyond the mountains waited one of the greatest fortified cities in the medieval world. Its walls had resisted conquerors for centuries. Its defenders were determined. Its siege would test the Crusaders more severely than any battle they had yet fought. The city was Antioch, and before its walls the Crusaders would experience hunger, disease, betrayal, despair, and one of the most dangerous moments of the entire First Crusade, the Siege of Antioch. Hunger, desperation, and the first great near defeat of the Crusader princes. After their victory at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders pressed deeper into the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. Every mile brought them closer to Jerusalem, but it also carried them farther from Europe. Their supply lines stretched across mountains, rivers, and hostile territory. Replacements were almost impossible to obtain, and every horse, every sword, and every sack of grain became increasingly valuable. By the autumn of 1097, the Crusader army reached one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, Antioch. For centuries, Antioch had stood as one of the most important cities in Christianity. It was wealthy, heavily fortified, and strategically vital. Massive stone walls climbed the surrounding mountains, guarded by hundreds of towers. Even before seeing them up close, many Crusaders realized that this would not be a quick victory.
The city was defended by Lusignan, experienced ruler who understood that Antioch's greatest strength was not only its walls, but also time itself. The Crusaders surrounded the city, hoping to starve it into surrender. Instead, they slowly began starving themselves. Their army was too small to completely encircle Antioch. Gaps remained through which food, supplies, and messengers could still enter the city. Meanwhile, the Crusaders had to feed tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, servants, and camp followers. At first, nearby villages provided enough food. Soon, those supplies disappeared. The surrounding countryside had already been stripped bare. Grain became scarce, fresh meat almost vanished. Prices soared beyond what ordinary soldiers could afford. The first winter was brutal. Cold winds swept through the camps. Rain turned the ground into deep mud. Tents leaked, clothing wore out. Disease spread rapidly among exhausted men weakened by hunger. Every morning more bodies were carried away. Some died from illness. Others simply starved. The once confident army began losing hope. Knights who had dreamed of glorious battles now searched desperately for food. Horses, once symbols of wealth and military power, died in alarming numbers. Without horses, heavy cavalry lost much of its battlefield advantage. Some soldiers ate roots and wild plants. Others hunted stray animals. Contemporary chroniclers even describe men boiling leather to make it soft enough to chew. Whether every account is literally true remains uncertain, but they revealed the depth of suffering inside the Crusader camp. Discipline also began to weaken. Some soldiers deserted. Others secretly slipped away under cover of darkness, believing the crusade had already failed. Each desertion reduced the army's strength and damaged morale further. The leaders faced constant arguments. Should they continue the siege? Should they retreat? Should they launch a direct assault? Every option carried enormous risks. Among the strongest advocates for perseverance was Bohemond I of Taranto. He believed Antioch must be taken at any cost. Others were less certain. Time, however, favored the defenders. Inside Antioch, Lusignan remained determined. He strengthened the city's defenses and maintained communication with neighboring Muslim rulers, urging them to send relief. He knew that if a large relief army arrived before the Crusaders captured the city, the invaders might be trapped between Antioch's walls and a powerful force approaching from outside. That danger soon became reality. News reached the Crusader camp that Muslim armies were gathering. The first relief force approached. The Crusader princes marched out to meet it before it could unite with Antioch's defenders. After fierce fighting, they managed to drive it away. The victory lifted spirits temporarily, but it solved none of their deeper problems. Food remained scarce. Disease continued spreading. Fresh relief armies could appear at any moment. As the months dragged on, the Crusaders realized that Antioch would not fall through hunger alone. They needed another solution. That opportunity appeared through betrayal. Inside the city lived a guard named Firouz. For reasons that remain debated by historians, whether personal resentment, financial reward, or political calculation, he secretly entered negotiations with Bohemond. Night after night, Messages passed between them. A dangerous plan slowly emerged. If Firuz opened one of the towers under his control, selected Crusaders could climb the walls and seize part of the city before the defenders realized what had happened. It was an enormous gamble. If discovered, everyone involved would almost certainly be executed. But the Crusaders believed they had no better option. On the night chosen for the attack, a small force quietly approached the walls. Ladders were raised. Men climbed in silence. Every sound seemed loud in the darkness. One mistake could alert the entire city. At last they reached the tower. Firuz fulfilled his promise. The gates were opened. Crusader soldiers poured into Antioch. Fierce street fighting erupted before dawn. Many defenders were caught completely by surprise. Gradually, resistance collapsed across much of the city. After nearly 8 months of suffering, the Crusaders had captured Antioch. Their joy, however, lasted only a matter of hours. The citadel overlooking the city remained in enemy hands. Even worse, another and far larger Muslim army was already approaching. It was commanded by Kerboka, one of the most powerful military leaders in the region. Instead of becoming conquerors, the Crusaders suddenly found themselves trapped inside the very city they had fought so hard to capture. The hunters had become the hunted. Kerboka surrounded Antioch almost immediately. Every escape route disappeared. Food supplies, already exhausted, ran out once again. Starvation returned with even greater severity. Disease spread through the overcrowded city. Dead animals lay in the streets. Hope began to fade. Many Crusaders believed the end had come. Some proposed surrender. Others attempted desperate escapes. Still others prayed continuously, convinced that only divine intervention could save them. Ironically, the Crusaders were now experiencing exactly what they had intended for Antioch's defenders. The siege had reversed. The besiegers had become the besieged. Their greatest victory had brought them closer than ever to complete destruction. For the second time since the crusade began, the entire expedition stood on the brink of military disaster. Only extraordinary determination and unexpected divisions within the enemy's own coalition would prevent Antioch from becoming one of the greatest Crusader defeats in history. The fate of the First Crusade now depended on a single desperate battle outside the walls of the city they had only just captured, the Battle of Antioch, escaping the brink of total defeat. The capture of Antioch should have been the greatest triumph of the First Crusade. Instead, it became one of its darkest moments. After enduring nearly 8 months of hunger, disease, exhaustion, and constant attacks, the Crusaders had finally entered the city. But victory had come too late. Before they could secure their prize, the massive army of Kerboka arrived outside Antioch and surrounded it from every direction. In an instant, everything changed. Only days earlier, the Crusaders had been the attackers. Now they were trapped. The gates that had opened to bring them victory had become the walls of their prison. Inside Antioch, conditions quickly became even worse than before. The city had already suffered months of siege. Food stores were nearly empty. Clean water was difficult to find.
Thousands of hungry soldiers crowded together inside streets, never designed to support such a large population. Disease spread with terrifying speed. Every morning more men died. The strongest knights became weak from starvation. Horses that had survived the long march across Anatolia now collapsed from lack of food. Some soldiers searched abandoned houses for scraps of grain. Others boiled leather belts and pieces of horse harness in desperate attempts to quiet their hunger. Morale reached its lowest point since the crusade had begun. Many believed that God had abandoned them. Desertions increased despite the danger. Under cover of darkness, a few soldiers climbed down the walls using ropes, hoping to escape Kerboga's army. Some disappeared forever. Others were captured before they had gone very far. Every escape weakened the Crusader force that remained. Meanwhile, Kerboga appeared completely confident. He commanded a coalition drawn from several Muslim territories. His army greatly outnumbered the starving Crusaders. From the walls of Antioch, Crusader scouts could see campfires stretching across the countryside. The message was unmistakable. No relief army was coming. No reinforcements were marching from Europe. If Antioch fell again, the First Crusade would almost certainly end in complete destruction. Yet beneath Kerboga's apparent strength lay hidden weaknesses. His coalition was large, but it was not united. Different emirs had joined the campaign for different reasons. Some hoped to destroy the Crusaders. Others were more concerned with protecting their own lands. Several distrusted Kerboga himself, fearing that a great victory would make him too powerful. These political divisions remained invisible to the Crusaders, but they would soon play a decisive role. Inside Antioch, another extraordinary event transformed morale. A poor monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear believed by many Christians to have pierced Jesus during the crucifixion. According to his account, the sacred relic lay buried beneath the floor of a church in Antioch. Many leaders doubted him. Others desperately wanted to believe. Excavation began. Hour after hour, men dug into the earth. Nothing appeared. Hope slowly faded. Then, according to medieval chroniclers, a spearhead was discovered. Whether it was truly the Holy Lance remains one of history's great debates. Some contemporaries accepted it as a miracle. Others believed it had been planted to encourage the army. Whatever the truth, its psychological impact was enormous. Men who had nearly surrendered suddenly believed that God was fighting beside them. Confidence returned. Prayers replaced despair. The starving army prepared for one final attempt to survive. The Crusader leaders reached a remarkable decision. Rather than waiting for starvation to destroy them, they would march out of Antioch and attack Kerboga's vastly larger army. It was an astonishing gamble. Their soldiers were exhausted. Many were weakened by hunger. They possessed fewer horses than ever before, yet remaining behind the walls meant certain defeat. On the morning of the battle, the gates of Antioch opened. The Crusader army marched out in disciplined formations. Priests walked among the soldiers, carrying crosses and offering prayers. The banners of the great princes fluttered above the ranks. For many men, this was not simply another battle. It was their last chance to live. Kerboga watched the Crusaders emerge. He expected them to break apart under pressure. Instead, they advanced steadily. His commanders urged immediate attack. Confident of victory, Kerboga delayed. He believed hunger had already defeated the enemy. He wanted to destroy them completely, in open ground. That hesitation proved costly. The Crusaders crossed the river and formed battle lines before the Muslim army launched its full assault. Turkish horse archers began their familiar tactics. Arrows filled the sky. Cavalry attacked from the flanks before retreating. But unlike the People's Crusade at Civito, or the isolated forces nearly overwhelmed at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders maintained their discipline. They refused to chase the horse archers. They held formation. Each division supported the others. As the battle continued, unexpected tensions emerged within Kerboga's coalition. Several allied commanders questioned his decisions. Some believed he had waited too long. Others feared being sacrificed for his ambitions. Gradually, parts of the coalition began withdrawing from the battlefield. What had seemed like an overwhelming army slowly lost its unity. The Crusaders noticed the confusion. Their commanders seized the opportunity. With renewed determination, the knights launched a coordinated advance. Heavy cavalry struck vulnerable sections of the enemy line. Infantry followed close behind. The pressure increased with every passing moment. Kerboga tried desperately to restore order. Messengers galloped across the battlefield. Commands were shouted. But discipline had begun to collapse. One retreat encouraged another. Soon, entire sections of the coalition were leaving the field. The balance of the battle shifted with astonishing speed. The Crusaders, who only hours earlier had expected death, now watched their enemy fall into confusion. Kerboga realized the battle could no longer be won. Rather than risking complete destruction of his own forces, he ordered a retreat. The siege of Antioch was over. Against all expectations, the starving Crusaders had survived. Their victory became one of the most dramatic reversals in medieval military history. Yet it also concealed dangerous lessons. Many Crusaders interpreted the outcome as proof that faith alone guaranteed success. They remembered the discovery of the Holy Lance. They remembered the enemy's retreat. Few fully appreciated how much their survival had depended on divisions within Kerboga's coalition. Had the Muslim commanders remained united? Had Kerboga attacked earlier? Had starvation continued for only a few more days? The First Crusade might have ended forever outside the walls of Antioch. Instead, the Crusaders marched onward. 1 year later, they would capture Jerusalem. To many observers, it appeared that nothing could stop them. But history would prove otherwise. Over the next 2 centuries, the same mistakes, political rivalry, overconfidence, poor logistics, divided leadership, and underestimating determined opponents, would return again and again. The
victories of the First Crusade would become legendary. Yet hidden within those victories were the seeds of future military disasters. The first of those true disasters would come after the Crusader states had been established in the Holy Land, when ambition and poor planning led an entire army into one of the most devastating defeats of the early crusading era. It was the Battle of Harran in 1104. There, for the first time, a major Crusader field army would be decisively destroyed after the conquest of Jerusalem. The Battle of Harran, 1104. The first great defeat of the Crusader states. In July 1099, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem after one of the most famous sieges in medieval history. Across Europe, church bells rang in celebration. Chroniclers describe the victory as proof that God had blessed the crusading cause. For the survivors who had endured the long march across Anatolia, the starvation at Antioch, and countless battles along the way, it seemed that every sacrifice had finally been rewarded. Yet capturing Jerusalem was not the end of the Crusades. It was only the beginning. The Crusaders now faced an entirely different challenge. Winning a city was one thing. Keeping it was another. Across the Holy Land, new Crusader states gradually emerged. Castles were repaired or constructed. Garrisons were established. Trade routes were secured where possible. European nobles divided conquered territories among themselves, creating fragile kingdoms surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors. These states appeared impressive on maps. In reality, they were dangerously vulnerable. Their population was small. Their armies were limited. Most castles depended upon reinforcements and supplies arriving from Europe by sea. A single major defeat could erase years of conquest. Despite these dangers, many Crusader leaders believed that continued expansion offered the best chance of survival. Rather than remaining on the defensive, they sought to capture more cities and secure additional territory before Muslim rulers could unite against them. One city drew particular attention: Harran. Located in northern Mesopotamia, Harran occupied an important strategic position. Whoever controlled it could influence trade routes and military movements across a wide region. Capturing the city promised both wealth and security, but it also carried enormous risks. The campaign brought together two powerful Crusader rulers. Baldwin II of Edessa joined forces with Bohemond I of Taranto, whose reputation had grown enormously since the First Crusade. Both men were capable commanders. Both possessed experienced knights. Yet both also carried great ambition. They believed the Muslim rulers remained divided and incapable of organizing effective resistance. That assumption would soon prove disastrous. Watching these movements carefully were two Muslim commanders. Sockman of Mardin and Jickermish understood that confronting the Crusaders separately would invite defeat. Instead, they formed a temporary alliance. It was a practical decision rather than a permanent partnership. Their immediate objective was simple: destroy the invading army before Harran could fall. Meanwhile, the Crusaders advanced confidently. The campaign began well enough. No major army blocked their progress. Supply lines remained functional. Morale
morale was high. Some knights believed another easy victory awaited them. But the Muslim commanders had no intention of defending Harran through a conventional siege.
Instead, they relied upon patience. Their cavalry observed every Crusader movement. Scouts monitored roads and water sources. The enemy remained just beyond reach. This frustrated many Crusader leaders.
They wanted a decisive battle. The Muslim army refused to provide one. As days passed, the Crusaders moved farther from their strongest bases. The heat became increasingly exhausting. Water required careful management. Communication between different units became more difficult. Then came the opportunity the Muslim commanders had been waiting for. Accounts differ regarding the precise sequence of events, but the overall pattern is remarkably consistent. The Crusader army became divided. Whether through aggressive pursuit, poor coordination, or misunderstanding between commanders, parts of the army moved ahead, while others lagged behind. The unity that had saved the Crusaders at Dorylaeum disappeared. The Muslim cavalry reacted immediately. Rather than attacking the entire Crusader force, they struck isolated elements. Horse archers harassed advancing units. Feigned retreats encouraged reckless pursuit. Dust clouds reduced visibility. Messengers struggled to locate different commanders. Confusion spread across the battlefield. Many Crusader knights believed they were chasing a defeated enemy. Instead, they were being drawn farther from support. Suddenly, the trap closed. Fresh Muslim cavalry appeared from multiple directions. The isolated Crusader force found itself surrounded. Arrows poured into the tightly packed knights. Repeated cavalry attacks prevented organized withdrawal. Every attempt to regroup met renewed resistance. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Heavy European cavalry excelled in close combat. But against highly mobile horse archers controlling the pace of battle, their advantages diminished rapidly. Horses became exhausted. Knights struggled to pursue enemies who refused to stand and fight. The more aggressively they attacked, the farther they became separated. Soon, retreat proved almost impossible. The fighting intensified. Crusader formations broke apart. Individual groups fought desperately for survival. Many knights were killed where they stood. Others were dragged from their horses and captured alive. Among the prisoners was Baldwin II. His capture shocked the Crusader states. A ruler who had expected conquest now faced years in captivity. The defeat itself was devastating enough. Its political consequences proved even greater. Beaumont escaped with part of the army, but the campaign had failed completely. Harran remained beyond Crusader control. Their aura of invincibility disappeared. For the first time since Jerusalem had fallen, Muslim rulers had decisively defeated a major Crusader field army. News spread rapidly throughout the region. The Crusaders could be beaten. Their heavy cavalry was not unstoppable. Their leaders could be captured. Their armies could be destroyed. This realization transformed the strategic balance. Until Harran, many Muslim rulers had viewed the Crusaders as an extraordinary threat, capable of defeating almost anyone in open battle. After Harran, confidence began to return.
Future commanders carefully studied what had happened. They noted the effectiveness of mobility. They observed the dangers created when Crusader armies divided. They recognized that patience often defeated reckless aggression. For the Crusaders, Harran exposed weaknesses that had existed since the very beginning. Ambition had encouraged unnecessary risk. Coordination between leaders had failed. Reliable intelligence had been lacking. The enemy had dictated the battlefield. These were precisely the mistakes that had doomed the People's Crusade years earlier. Only now the victims were not untrained pilgrims. They were veteran Crusader knights. The defeat at Harran marked a turning point. Although the Crusader states survived, they no longer possessed the same confidence they had enjoyed after Jerusalem. Their enemies had learned. And those lessons would become even more dangerous in the decades ahead. The next great disaster would come at a place whose very name reflected the horror that followed. Medieval chroniclers would forever remember it as the Field of Blood. There, an entire Crusader army would be wiped out, and one of the most respected Crusader leaders would lose his life. The Battle of the Field of Blood, 1119, when an entire Crusader army was destroyed. The defeat at Harran in 1104 shattered the illusion that the Crusader states were invincible. For the first time since the capture of Jerusalem, a major Crusader army had been decisively beaten in the field. Leaders had been captured, expansion had stalled, and Muslim rulers had gained a renewed sense of confidence. Yet the Crusader states still survived. Over the next 15 years, they rebuilt their armies, repaired their castles, and strengthened their defenses. Reinforcements continued to arrive from Europe, while local Christian communities helped maintain the fragile frontier. Peace, however, was always temporary. Raids, sieges, and border skirmishes became a normal part of life. Every fortress along the frontier stood as a reminder that another major war could begin at any moment. Among the Muslim leaders rising during this period was Il-Ghazi. Il-Ghazi was not simply a brave warrior. He was an experienced commander who understood both politics and warfare. He knew that defeating the Crusaders required more than courage. It demanded patience, careful planning, and the ability to unite rival Muslim rulers behind a common objective. His opportunity came in 1119. At that time, the Principality of Antioch faced growing pressure along its northern frontier. Raids had increased, villages were threatened, and frontier castles called urgently for support. The responsibility for defending Antioch fell largely upon Roger of Salerno. Roger was an experienced knight and had earned respect through years of campaigning. But during this crisis, he faced a difficult choice. Should he wait for reinforcements from neighboring Crusader states? Or should he attack immediately before Il-Ghazi's army grew even larger? Some advisors urged caution. They argued that the enemy was too strong. Others insisted that delaying would only encourage further Muslim advances. Roger ultimately chose action. He gathered his available forces and marched north to confront Il-Ghazi. It was a decision that would determine the fate of an entire army. The Crusader force was relatively small. It included heavily armored knights, infantry, archers, and supporting troops. Although disciplined, it lacked the numbers available during the First Crusade. Many experienced soldiers were stationed elsewhere. Reinforcements had not yet arrived. Still, confidence remained high. The Crusaders believed that their superior heavy cavalry could once again overcome a larger enemy. Meanwhile, Il-Ghazi carefully observed every movement. His scouts reported the Crusaders' advance. He noted their numbers. He studied the terrain. Rather than rushing into battle, he selected ground that favored his own army. Near a place known as the Field of Blood, the two forces approached one another. The name itself was not yet famous. History would soon change that forever. Roger's army established camp without fully appreciating the danger surrounding them. Some contemporary accounts suggest that scouts failed to detect the full strength of Il-Ghazi's forces. Others indicate that Roger underestimated the speed with which the Muslim army could concentrate. Whatever the exact reason, the Crusaders found themselves in a far more dangerous position than they realized. Before dawn, Il-Ghazi made his move. His army advanced rapidly. Instead of allowing the Crusaders time to organize, he struck while confusion still filled the camp. The attack came with shocking speed. Trumpets sounded. War cries echoed across the valley. Horse archers surged forward, filling the air with arrows. Crusader soldiers scrambled to form battle lines. Some knights managed to mount their horses. Others fought on foot. The army had little time to prepare. Even so, Roger attempted to restore order. His banners rose above the confusion as he directed his knights into formation. For a brief moment, it appeared that discipline might save them. Then the full weight of Il-Ghazi's army descended. Wave after wave of mounted archers struck the Crusader lines. Arrows rained down relentlessly. Whenever the knights attempted a charge, the enemy withdrew just beyond reach. When the Crusaders slowed or broke formation, fresh attacks came from another direction. The battlefield became a deadly cycle of pursuit and retreat. The Muslim cavalry controlled the pace of the fight. The Crusaders reacted rather than dictated events. Gradually, fatigue began taking its toll. Heavy armor became exhausting beneath the summer heat. Horses weakened. Infantry struggled to keep formation. Every casualty widened the gaps in the line. Il-Ghazi recognized the moment. He ordered a general assault. Mounted warriors attacked from multiple directions at once. The Crusader formation finally broke. Once discipline collapsed, the battle became a massacre. Groups of knights fought desperately, surrounded on every side. Some defended their banners until the very end. Others attempted to cut their way out. Few succeeded. Roger himself refused to flee. He continued fighting alongside his men until he was killed on the battlefield. His death shattered what remained of organized resistance. Without their commander, the surviving Crusaders lost all hope of coordinated defense. Many were cut down where they stood. Others were captured. Only a handful escaped to carry news of the disaster back to Antioch. The battlefield was covered with bodies.
Medieval chroniclers described the destruction as almost unimaginable. So many Crusaders had died that later generations remembered the place simply as the Field of Blood. The defeat sent shockwaves through every Crusader state. Antioch had lost most of its field army. Its frontier defenses had collapsed. For a brief moment it appeared that the principality itself might disappear. Panic spread through towns and castles. Messengers rode desperately to neighboring Crusader rulers, requesting immediate assistance. Fortunately for the Crusaders, El-Ghazi did not fully exploit his victory. His coalition lacked the unity and logistical strength needed to launch an immediate conquest of Antioch itself. This hesitation allowed reinforcements from the Kingdom of Jerusalem to arrive. The city was saved, but the damage had already been done. The Field of Blood became another painful lesson in Crusader history. Once again, a Crusader commander had engaged the enemy without sufficient support. Once again, intelligence had proved inadequate. Once again, mobile cavalry and careful planning had overwhelmed even brave and experienced knights. The defeat also strengthened the growing belief among Muslim rulers that the Crusader states could be defeated through patience, coordination, and superior strategy. The era of easy Crusader victories was ending. Even greater challenges were approaching. Within a generation, new Muslim leaders would emerge with ambitions far greater than frontier raids. They sought not merely to defeat Crusader armies, but to drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land altogether. The next major disaster would unfold during the Second Crusade when Europe's greatest kings marched east with enormous armies, only to suffer one of the most humiliating military failures of the entire crusading era. The Second Crusade. How Europe's greatest kings led a crusade to disaster. The catastrophe at the Field of Blood demonstrated that the Crusader states were no longer secure. Although Antioch survived, its army had been devastated, and Muslim rulers increasingly believed that the balance of power was beginning to change. For nearly 2 decades, both sides fought a series of smaller campaigns. Castles changed hands. Border raids continued. Temporary truces were signed and broken. Neither side gained a decisive advantage. Then in 1144, everything changed. The first Crusader state ever established in the East suffered a disaster that stunned the Christian world. The county of Edessa fell to the army of Zengi. Edessa had always been the most vulnerable of the Crusader states. It lay farther east than the others and was difficult to defend. Its population was relatively small, and its rulers depended heavily on support from neighboring Crusader territories. When Zengi attacked, that support did not arrive in time. After a determined siege, the city fell. The loss echoed across Europe. For the first time since the success of the First Crusade, an entire Crusader state had been destroyed. Many Christians viewed the fall of Edessa as a warning. If one Crusader state could disappear, the others might soon follow. The response was immediate. Church leaders called for another great expedition. Among the most influential voices was Bernard of Clairvaux. Traveling across Europe, he delivered passionate sermons urging kings and nobles to take up the cross
once again. His message inspired thousands. Unlike the First Crusade, this new expedition would not be led primarily by ambitious nobles. It would be commanded by kings. Two of Europe's most powerful monarchs answered the call. Louis VII of France assembled a massive French army. Soon afterward, Conrad III of Germany organized another enormous force. Never before had so much royal power been committed to a crusade. Across Europe, optimism spread. Many believed the mistakes of earlier campaigns would not be repeated. Professional armies, powerful kings, abundant resources. Surely this crusade would succeed where smaller expeditions had struggled. Yet beneath the confidence lay familiar problems. The French and German armies did not always cooperate. Each king maintained his own advisors. Each army followed different routes. Coordination remained limited. Political rivalry never disappeared completely. As the German army entered Byzantine territory, tensions emerged almost immediately. Relations between the Crusaders and Emperor Manuel I Komnenos were strained. The Byzantines worried that such enormous armies might threaten imperial lands as much as Muslim territory. The Crusaders, meanwhile, suspected Byzantine officials of withholding supplies and offering poor guidance. Whether these suspicions were justified or exaggerated remains debated. But mutual distrust affected nearly every major decision. Eventually, Conrad's army crossed into Anatolia. There, the familiar pattern returned. The Seljuk Turks avoided large-scale confrontation. Instead, they harassed the advancing columns. Horse archers attacked from long range. Supply wagons became targets. Water sources grew increasingly difficult to secure. The deeper the Crusaders advanced, the weaker they became. Food shortages developed. Heat exhausted heavily armored soldiers. Communication between different units became more difficult. Despite these warning signs, the German army continued forward. Near Dorylaeum, the very region where the First Crusade had once achieved a famous victory, the Seljuks launched their attack. This time the outcome proved very different. The German army became stretched across difficult terrain. Its formations lost cohesion. Turkish cavalry struck repeatedly from every direction. Arrows rained down without pause. Whenever German knights attempted to charge, the horse archers disappeared into the distance. Hours of constant harassment shattered discipline. Confusion spread. Retreat became disorder. Disorder became panic. Large sections of Conrad's army were destroyed. Thousands died. Many more deserted during the retreat. The survivors struggled back toward Byzantine territory. Conrad himself narrowly escaped with his life. The First Royal Army of the Second Crusade had suffered a crushing defeat. Soon afterward, Louis VII's French army faced similar dangers. Having witnessed the fate of the Germans, the French attempted greater caution. Even so, the journey across Anatolia proved devastating. Constant attacks wore down the army day after day. Supplies dwindled. Morale declined. Then came one of the campaign's greatest disasters. While crossing the steep mountains near Mount Cadmus, confusion spread through the marching column. The vanguard moved too far ahead. The rear struggled along narrow mountain paths. Communication failed. The army became dangerously divided. The Seljuks immediately recognized the opportunity. Horse archers occupied the surrounding high ground. From above, they showered the Crusaders with arrows. Panic erupted along the mountain trails. Men slipped from cliffs. Pack animals carrying food and equipment tumbled into ravines. Knights found it nearly impossible to maneuver their horses on the narrow paths. Those who attempted to counterattack discovered that the enemy had already withdrawn. Then fresh attacks came from another direction. The entire column began collapsing. Thousands were killed. Many valuable supplies were abandoned forever. Only determined resistance by experienced knights prevented complete annihilation. Louis himself survived only with great difficulty. According to several accounts, he was forced to climb onto rocky ground and defend himself until the immediate danger passed. The proud French army eventually reached the Mediterranean coast. But it was no longer the powerful force that had left Europe. Disease, starvation, exhaustion, and constant fighting had reduced it dramatically. By the time the French and German kings reunited in the Holy Land, neither army possessed the strength originally expected. Even so, the crusade continued. The leaders debated their next objective. Some favored attacking Aleppo. Others argued for strengthening existing Crusader territories. Eventually, they chose a target that surprised many observers: Damascus. For decades, Damascus had sometimes cooperated with the Crusader states against more dangerous rivals. Attacking it risked creating exactly the united Muslim front the Crusaders hoped to avoid. Nevertheless, the decision was made. The consequences would become one of the greatest strategic mistakes in crusading history. The siege that followed would not merely fail, it would permanently damage the reputation of the Second Crusade and strengthen the Muslim powers that would soon dominate the region. The Siege of Damascus, the greatest strategic blunder of the Second Crusade. By the summer of 1148, the surviving armies of the Second Crusade had finally reached the Holy Land. The journey itself had already become a nightmare. The German army had been shattered in Anatolia. The French army had suffered enormous losses crossing mountains and hostile territory. Thousands of experienced knights had died before ever seeing their intended battlefield. Yet despite these disasters, hope remained. The Crusader kings believed that one decisive victory could restore the reputation of the expedition. To determine their next move, the leading rulers gathered near Jerusalem. Among those present were Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, and Baldwin III. Together they faced a difficult decision. Several important Muslim cities lay within reach. Aleppo had long been viewed as one of the greatest threats to the Crusader states. Capturing it would weaken Muslim power in northern Syria. Others argued for reinforcing existing Crusader territories instead of launching another risky offensive. But after long discussions, the leaders chose Damascus. At At first glance, the decision appeared logical. Damascus was wealthy. It occupied an important strategic position. Its capture would expand the Kingdom of Jerusalem and demonstrate that the Second Crusade still possessed strength. Yet many experienced observers questioned the plan. For years, Damascus had sometimes acted as a useful counterweight against more aggressive Muslim rulers. Although relations were never entirely peaceful, the city had occasionally cooperated with the Crusaders when faced with common enemies. Attacking Damascus threatened to destroy that fragile balance. It risked driving previously cautious Muslim leaders into a united alliance. Nevertheless, preparations began. In July 1148, the Crusader army marched toward Damascus. The city stood among fertile orchards and abundant water supplies. Dense gardens surrounded its walls, creating both opportunities and dangers. The Crusaders initially approached from the west. This area contained plentiful fruit trees and flowing water. At first, the campaign seemed promising. The Crusaders fought their way through the orchards despite determined resistance. Many believed the city might soon fall. Inside Damascus, however, the defenders refused to panic. Their commanders strengthened the walls. Archers occupied every advantageous position. Messengers rode urgently across Syria, requesting assistance from neighboring Muslim rulers. Every passing day increased the danger facing the Crusaders. Time once again became the deciding factor. The longer the siege continued, the greater the chance that powerful relief armies would arrive. Meanwhile, disagreements began spreading through the Crusader camp. Who would rule Damascus if it fell? Would it belong to the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Would one of the European kings receive it? Would another noble claim authority? Instead of concentrating entirely on the siege, influential leaders argued over rewards that had not yet been won. These political disputes damaged unity at the worst possible moment. Then came the decision that transformed a difficult campaign into a disaster. For reasons still debated by historians, the Crusader leaders abandoned their favorable western position and moved their army to the eastern side of Damascus. Several explanations have been offered. Some believe the eastern walls were less heavily defended. Others suspected political intrigue. Some argued that local advisors provided poor information. Whatever the reason, the consequences were immediate. The eastern side lacked the abundant orchards and reliable water that had supported the army during the first days of the siege. The terrain was far less favorable. Food became scarce almost immediately. Fresh water grew difficult to obtain. The defenders, by contrast, recognized the opportunity. They intensified their attacks. Archers harassed every Crusader movement. Small cavalry units struck isolated groups before disappearing behind the city's defenses. At the same time, alarming news reached the Crusader camp. Powerful Muslim relief forces were approaching. Among the commanders expected to arrive was Nur ad-Din, whose growing reputation as both a capable general and determined political leader made him one of the most dangerous opponents the Crusaders had yet faced. Whether his army was only days away or still farther behind mattered little. The mere possibility created panic. among many Crusader leaders. Their army was already weakened. Supplies were dwindling.
Morale had begun to decline. If they remained too long, they risked becoming trapped between Damascus and a large relief force. Arguments became increasingly bitter. Some demanded an immediate assault. Others insisted upon withdrawal.
Trust between commanders deteriorated rapidly. After only 4 days of siege, the decision was made. The Crusader army would retreat. The withdrawal stunned both friend and foe.
The defenders of Damascus could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The city that had appeared on the verge of collapse was suddenly safe. The Crusaders abandoned the campaign without achieving any of their objectives. No great battle had destroyed them. No dramatic massacre had taken place. Yet the failure proved one of the greatest strategic defeats in crusading history. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The prestige of the Second Crusade collapsed. Across Europe, people struggled to understand how two powerful kings, leading enormous armies, had accomplished so little. The expedition that had promised to recover lost territory ended without capturing a single major objective. For the Muslim world, the failed siege carried an equally important lesson. Damascus now recognized that cooperation with the Crusaders offered little security. Instead, the city's leaders increasingly turned toward alliances with stronger Muslim rulers. This shift greatly strengthened the position of Nur ad-Din. Within a few years, Damascus came under his control. Rather than weakening Muslim power, the Second Crusade had helped unite it. The Crusaders had achieved exactly the opposite of what they intended. The expedition also revealed familiar patterns that had appeared throughout Crusader history. Political rivalry, poor strategic judgment, weak coordination, failure to agree on long-term objectives, ignoring the importance of logistics. Every one of these weaknesses contributed to defeat. Unlike the disaster at Civito or the slaughter at the Field of Blood, the siege of Damascus was not remembered for the destruction of an army. It was remembered because it changed the balance of power across the Middle East. Its failure cleared the path for a new generation of Muslim leaders who would pursue a far more ambitious goal. Not simply defeating Crusader armies, but recovering Jerusalem itself.
Among those rising under the leadership of Nur ad-Din was a young commander whose name would become legendary throughout history. That man was Saladin. His rise would eventually lead to the greatest Crusader military catastrophe of them all, the Battle of Hattin.
But before Hattin, another devastating defeat would strike the Crusader states at the Battle of Inab in 1149, where one of their most influential rulers would lose both his army and his life. The Battle of Inab, 1149, the death of a prince and the collapse of northern Crusader power. The failure of the Second Crusade left the Crusader states weaker than they had been in decades. The great armies from Europe had returned home. The promises of victory had faded. The defeat at Damascus had damaged morale, weakened political unity, and strengthened Muslim alliances across Syria. No one benefited more from this changing balance of power than Nur ad-Din.
The son of Zengi, Nur ad-Din inherited not only territory, but also a clear vision. He believed that the Muslim states could defeat the Crusaders only by setting aside their rivalries and working together. Unlike many earlier rulers, he combined military ability with political patience. He avoided unnecessary risks. He strengthened alliances. He improved discipline within his armies. He understood that time favored those who could remain united. While Nur ad-Din expanded his influence, the Crusader states struggled with familiar problems. Their rulers often disagreed. Resources remained limited. Every major defeat was difficult to replace because the population of the Crusader kingdoms was relatively small. One of the most important leaders in northern Syria was Reynald of Poitiers. Reynald was courageous and ambitious. He believed that strong offensive action offered the best defense for Antioch. Waiting behind castle walls, in his view, would only encourage further Muslim attacks. Many of his advisors admired his determination. Others warned that the situation had changed. Nur ad-Din commanded larger and more organized forces than many previous opponents. Ignoring that reality could prove disastrous. In 1149, tensions along the frontier increased once again. Muslim forces threatened territories controlled by Antioch. Reynald decided to respond quickly. Rather than waiting for substantial reinforcements from the Kingdom of Jerusalem or neighboring allies, he gathered the troops immediately available and marched towards the frontier. It was a bold decision. It was also a dangerous one. His army was respectable but relatively small. It included experienced knights, infantry, and local allies. Yet it lacked the overwhelming strength needed for a prolonged campaign against Nur ad-Din's growing coalition. Meanwhile, Nur ad-Din had been carefully observing Crusader movements. His scouts kept him informed of Reynald's advance. He understood that the Prince of Antioch was moving without the full support of the southern Crusader states. This presented an opportunity. Rather than avoiding battle, Nur ad-Din decided the moment had come to strike. The two armies approached one another near the village of Inab. The countryside consisted of rolling hills, open ground, and scattered rocky terrain, land suitable for mobile cavalry, as well as determined defensive action. Reynald believed he could force a decisive engagement. He trusted the fighting ability of his knights. He believed speed and aggression would offset his numerical disadvantage. But Nur ad-Din had prepared carefully. He deployed his cavalry to exploit every weakness. Horse archers moved constantly around the Crusader force, probing for vulnerable positions. Scouts reported every change in the Crusader formation. The Muslim commander waited patiently. He refused to attack before the conditions favored him. When the moment finally arrived, the assault came swiftly. Arrows darkened the sky. Mounted archers struck from multiple directions. The Crusader knights attempted to counterattack, lowering their lances and charging toward the enemy. As so many times before, the Muslim cavalry withdrew before contact. The knights pursued, then fresh attacks came from the flanks. The pattern repeated again and again. Every charge consumed energy. Every pursuit stretched the Crusader formation. Gradually, gaps began to appear. Nur ad-Din recognized the opportunity immediately. He ordered a coordinated attack against the weakened sections of Raymond's line. The fighting became desperate. Crusader infantry struggled to maintain formation, while mounted knights attempted to regroup. Conflicting orders spread confusion. Dust filled the air, reducing visibility across the battlefield. Communication became increasingly difficult. Raymond realized too late that his army was being surrounded. Escape routes narrowed with every passing minute. The battle reached its climax. The Prince of Antioch refused to abandon his men. He remained in the thick of the fighting, rallying his knights for one final stand. Medieval chroniclers describe fierce hand-to-hand combat as Crusader knights fought desperately against overwhelming numbers. One by one they fell. Eventually, Raymond himself was killed. According to several historical accounts, his head was later sent to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as a symbol of Nur ad-Din's victory. Whether viewed as a political message or a military trophy, the act demonstrated the enormous significance of the battle. The death of Raymond shattered what remained of organized Crusader resistance. His army collapsed. Many soldiers died where they fought. Others attempted to flee but were overtaken by pursuing cavalry. Only a small number escaped. The Battle of Inab became another devastating military defeat for the Crusader states. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Antioch had lost its ruler. Its army had been crippled. Much of its northern frontier lay exposed. For a brief time it seemed possible that the entire principality might collapse. Yet once again, circumstances prevented complete disaster. Nur ad-Din had won a magnificent victory, but capturing Antioch itself proved more difficult. The city's formidable defenses remained intact. Reinforcements from the Kingdom of Jerusalem soon moved north. The immediate crisis passed. Even so, the balance of power had shifted again. Nur ad-Din's prestige soared throughout the Muslim world. His reputation as the leading defender of Islam against the Crusader states grew stronger with every victory. Young officers and soldiers increasingly looked to him as the man capable of achieving what earlier rulers had failed to accomplish. Among those serving under his influence was a talented Kurdish commander whose future would reshape the history of the Crusades. His name was Saladin. The Crusaders, meanwhile, failed to solve the deeper problems that had contributed to defeat after defeat. They still argued among themselves. They still launched campaigns before assembling sufficient strength. They still underestimated patient and disciplined opponents. The Battle of Inab reinforced one lesson above all others. A brave commander could inspire his men. He could lead from the front. He could refuse to retreat. But courage alone could not overcome poor strategy, numerical disadvantage, and an enemy who had learned from decades of warfare. The road now led toward an even greater transformation. Nur ad-Din would continue expanding his influence. Saladin would soon rise to prominence. And within a generation, the Crusader states would face the most devastating military disaster in their history. The road to the Battle of Hattin had already begun. From Nur ad-Din to Saladin, how Crusader mistakes created their greatest enemy, The defeated Enab in 1149 marked far more than the death of a Crusader prince. It signaled the arrival of a new era. For decades, the Crusader states had survived because the Muslim world was divided. Powerful rulers often fought one another instead of concentrating on the Latin kingdoms established after the First Crusade. Whenever the Crusaders faced danger in one region, rival Muslim leaders elsewhere frequently prevented a united response. That situation was changing. At the center of that transformation stood Nur ad-Din. Unlike many rulers before him, Nur ad-Din believed that lasting victory required more than winning battles. He wanted to unite Syria and eventually Egypt under a single political and military authority. Only then, he argued, could the Crusader states be confronted with overwhelming strength. He invested in fortifications. He improved military organization. He promoted justice and religious scholarship to strengthen his legitimacy. He built alliances carefully, avoiding reckless campaigns that might weaken his position. Meanwhile, the Crusader states continued to struggle with familiar weaknesses. The rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and other territories rarely acted as a completely unified political system. Every succession crisis created new rivalries. Every disputed inheritance divided powerful nobles. Personal ambition often competed with military necessity. Many frontier castles required constant repair. Garrisons needed wages. European reinforcements arrived irregularly. The Crusader states remained formidable, but increasingly fragile. The next great contest centered not on Jerusalem or Antioch, but on Egypt. During the middle of the 12th century, Egypt was ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate. Internal political struggles had left the government unstable. Powerful officials competed for influence. Assassinations and palace intrigues became common. Both the Crusaders and Nur ad-Din understood Egypt's enormous importance. Its fertile farmland produced wealth. Its ports connected Mediterranean trade. Its resources could sustain large armies. Whoever controlled Egypt would dramatically alter the balance of power. Several Crusader expeditions attempted to interfere in Egyptian politics. At times they supported one faction, at other times they invaded directly. These interventions achieved temporary gains, but failed to establish permanent control. Instead, they created opportunities for Nur ad-Din. Among the commanders he sent into Egypt was his trusted general Shirkuh. Accompanying Shirkuh was a younger officer who attracted little attention at first. His name was Saladin. Few people in either camp imagined that this quiet, disciplined commander would become the Crusaders' greatest opponent. Saladin did not immediately appear as the fearless conqueror later celebrated in history. He was cautious. He listened carefully to experienced advisors. He studied administration as well as warfare. Rather than seeking personal glory, he focused on completing each assignment successfully. This approach gradually earned Nur ad-Din's confidence. Campaigns in Egypt became increasingly complex. Crusader armies entered the country more than once. Local Egyptian factions shifted alliances repeatedly. 1 month Yesterday's ally became today's enemy. Political agreements dissolved almost as quickly as they were signed. Eventually, Shirkuh emerged victorious. After his death in 1169, Saladin unexpectedly became the leading Muslim authority in Egypt. Some powerful men doubted him. Others believed he lacked the experience to govern such an important land. Saladin quietly proved them wrong. Instead of rushing into unnecessary wars, he strengthened Egypt's finances. He reorganized the army. He secured loyalty. Among local leaders, he improved administration. Most importantly, he remained outwardly loyal to Nur ad-Din while steadily increasing his own influence. Back in the Crusader states, many leaders underestimated these developments. Their attention remained fixed on local disputes. Some nobles argued over castles. Others competed for political influence within Jerusalem. Temporary truces created a false sense of security. Few recognized how dramatically the strategic situation was changing. For the first time since the First Crusade, a single Muslim ruler was gradually gaining control over both Syria and Egypt. This was precisely the nightmare earlier Crusader kings had hoped to prevent. After Nur ad-Din died in 1174, many expected his territories to fall into civil war. Instead, Saladin moved carefully. He did not seize everything by force. He negotiated where possible. He fought only when necessary. Step by step, city after city accepted his authority. Aleppo, Damascus, Egypt, large parts of Syria. The political divisions that had protected the Crusader states for generations slowly disappeared. By the late 1170s, Saladin commanded resources far greater than those available to any previous Muslim leader of the crusading era. His armies drew soldiers from multiple regions. His treasury funded long campaigns. His commanders cooperated under a unified strategy. He also possessed something equally valuable: patience. Saladin understood that destroying the Crusader states would not happen through reckless attacks. He waited for opportunities. He observed political disagreements inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He watched ambitious nobles argue among themselves. He allowed some truces to continue because time increasingly favored him. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, internal tensions continued growing. Powerful families competed for influence over the throne of Jerusalem. Questions of succession divided the nobility. Personal rivalries sometimes overshadowed military planning. Among the most controversial figures of the period was Reynald of Châtillon. Bold, fearless, and unpredictable, Reynald repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans and launched raids that violated existing truces. Some Crusader leaders admired his courage. Others feared his recklessness. Saladin viewed these attacks not simply as border incidents, but as serious breaches of diplomatic agreements. Each raid increased tension. Each broken truce made peaceful coexistence less likely. Meanwhile, Saladin continued preparing. He strengthened alliances. He trained his armies. He gathered intelligence. He waited for the moment when the Crusader kingdom would be politically divided and militarily exposed. That moment was approaching rapidly. Within a few years, The kingdom of Jerusalem would face its greatest crisis, a disputed succession, divided leadership, conflicting military advice, and a decision to march across one of the driest landscapes in the Holy Land during the height of summer. The result would become the most famous military disaster in Crusader history, the Battle of Hattin. There, nearly the entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem would be destroyed, its king captured, the true cross lost, and the road to Jerusalem opened for Saladin. The end of the Crusader states and the legacy of their defeats. The road from the disaster of the People's Crusade to the rise of Saladin had been paved with the same mistakes repeated across generations: overconfidence, political division, poor coordination, ignoring experienced advice, underestimating determined enemies, yet the greatest catastrophe was still to come. In 1187, after years of rising tension, the Kingdom of Jerusalem made the decision that would define the history of the Crusades forever. King Guy of Lusignan led the Crusader field army across the scorching plains of Galilee to relieve the fortress of Tiberias. Many experienced commanders urged caution. Raymond III of Tripoli warned that Saladin wanted exactly this. The Crusaders should remain near reliable water and force the enemy to attack. Instead, they marched into the dry summer heat. It was exactly the battlefield that Saladin had carefully chosen. His cavalry surrounded the advancing army. Water became impossible to reach. Horse archers attacked without rest. Smoke from burning grass filled the air. Men weakened from thirst before the decisive battle even began. By the time the Crusaders reached the twin peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin, exhaustion had already destroyed much of their fighting strength. The Battle of Hattin became the greatest military disaster in Crusader history. Wave after wave of Muslim cavalry shattered the exhausted Crusader formations. The famous heavy cavalry charges lacked their usual power because dying horses and thirsty soldiers could no longer maintain momentum. The sacred true cross carried by the Crusader army was captured. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Thousands more became prisoners. King Guy himself was captured alive. Many leading nobles shared his fate. Among the prisoners stood Reynald of Châtillon. For years he had broken truces and attacked Muslim caravans. Saladin considered him personally responsible for repeated violations of peace. According to medieval accounts, Saladin offered King Guy water but refused mercy to Reynald. Reynald was executed. The defeat at Hattin left the Kingdom of Jerusalem almost defenseless. There was no major field army left to stop Saladin. One city after another surrendered: Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon. Most offered little resistance because few defenders remained. Then came the greatest prize, Jerusalem. Unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, Saladin negotiated the city's surrender. Many inhabitants were allowed to ransom themselves. Others were freed through charitable payments. Although suffering remained inevitable during such a dramatic transfer of power, the city avoided the mass slaughter that many had feared. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe. The loss inspired the Third Crusade. 3 of Europe's greatest rulers answered the call: Richard the I of England, Philip II of France, Frederick I Barbarossa. Yet even this mighty expedition suffered serious setbacks. Frederick drowned before reaching the Holy Land. Philip returned to France before the campaign ended. Richard won brilliant victories at Arsuf and Jaffa but could not recapture Jerusalem. The Third Crusade prevented complete collapse but failed to reverse Hattin's consequences. The disasters continued. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. Instead, political intrigue and financial problems diverted the expedition toward Constantinople. In 1204, Crusaders captured and looted the greatest Christian city in the Eastern Roman world. The event permanently damaged relations between Eastern and Western Christianity. Rather than strengthening the crusading movement, it weakened one of its oldest potential allies.
The Fifth Crusade targeted Egypt. Initial success at Damietta encouraged overconfidence. Ignoring experienced advice, the Crusaders advanced toward Cairo. Seasonal flooding trapped the army. Supplies disappeared.
Retreat became impossible. The expedition surrendered. The city they had captured was returned simply to save the army from destruction. The Seventh Crusade repeated many of the same mistakes. Led by Louis IX of France, the Crusaders again invaded Egypt. They captured Damietta with remarkable ease. Once more, early victory created dangerous confidence. At Mansurah, confusion, poor coordination, and determined resistance shattered the expedition. Louis IX himself became a prisoner. A king who had dreamed of liberating Jerusalem instead negotiated his own release. The Eighth Crusade ended even before reaching its primary objective. Disease swept through the camp in North Africa.
Louis IX died. The expedition collapsed. Meanwhile, Muslim powers grew stronger. The Mamluk Sultanate emerged as the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. Its armies combined discipline, mobility, and excellent leadership. Castle after castle fell. One Crusader fortress after another disappeared. Finally, in 1291, the city of Acre, the last great Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, came under siege. For weeks, defenders fought desperately.
Knights of the military order stood beside local soldiers and civilians. Every street became a battlefield. Every tower became a fortress. But the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. The walls were breached. The city fell. With Acre's destruction, nearly 2 centuries of Crusader rule in the Holy Land effectively came to an end. The dream born at Clermont in 1095 had reached its conclusion. Looking back across those 200 years, one pattern appears again and again. The Crusaders rarely lacked courage. From Antioch to Hattin, from Damietta to Acre, individual acts of heroism filled every campaign. Knights fought to the last. Commanders often led from the front. Ordinary soldiers endured extraordinary hardship. Yet courage alone could not overcome deeper structural problems. Political rivalries repeatedly divided commanders. Supply systems failed. Armies marched without adequate water. Kings ignored experienced advisors. Victories created overconfidence. Defeats weakened already limited manpower. Meanwhile, their opponents evolved. Leaders such as Nur ad-Din, Saladin, and the Mamluk sultans studied earlier campaigns. They improved coordination. They united rival factions. They mastered logistics. They chose battlefields carefully. They understood that patience often defeated reckless bravery. In the end, the Crusades were not decided by one battle. They were shaped by hundreds of decisions, some wise, many disastrous. Every major military defeat became a lesson. Some lessons were learned, others were forgotten. Today, historians continue to study these campaigns, not only because they changed the medieval Middle East and Europe, but because they reveal timeless truths about warfare. No army is invincible. No victory guarantees the next. Discipline outweighs enthusiasm. Logistics often matter more than bravery. Unity is stronger than ambition. And history remembers not only those who won battles, but also those who failed to learn from defeat. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusaders fought across deserts, mountains, forests, rivers, and fortified cities. They experienced moments of astonishing triumph. They endured catastrophes that destroyed kingdoms. Their defeats reshaped empires, transformed diplomacy, and altered the course of medieval history. Their story remains one of the most remarkable and cautionary military histories ever recorded.